Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. We're continuing our coverage of the Gaza conflict with another important voice. So we're happy to welcome to the show Layla Al-Sheikh, who is a DSA organizer and a writer on Palestinian issues. Has an article in Jacobin that just came out. I believe it was today, Friday, when we're recording this. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I thought, to kick the discussion off a little bit, maybe we could review sort of the latest news. So Biden has visited Israel, and it appears as though Israel is preparing an invasion, possibly. It's fairly unclear about, what precisely is going to happen. But what's your read on like the latest sort of, over the last week, basically, of what's happening in Gaza?
So I would say that in essence, what we're looking at is what I wrote in Jacobin and what I'm writing elsewhere in Dissent and some other places that will come out soon, is that this is the most volatile crisis that we're looking at since 1948, I think. It is already a deadlier event for Israelis than the entirety of the Second Intifada. And this is shaping up to be significantly deadlier than 2014 or 1988. And the psychological wounds for Palestinians are far greater than Sabra and Shatila in 1982. And yes, we are looking at a ground invasion as far as we can tell. I saw that ABC, just before coming on, I saw that ABC News reports that the Israeli military has a green light to move into Gaza, and that Barak Ravid of Axios reported immediately following Biden's visit to Israel that Biden didn't really set a parameter against a ground invasion, but rather was only looking for a defined war goal, which the Israelis did not really provide. To what extent we know that there's a war goal is very limited. Israeli officials are having a public spat with one another, the defense minister, the finance minister, over what they perceive to be a victory in this scenario. And for Gazans, we're looking at the deadliest sustained airstrike campaign ever. We're looking at mass displacements. I think AP and the Gazan Health Ministry have both reported that over 400,000 Gazans have been already internally displaced. So this is a significant refugee crisis. And then something that's under discussed, is that the occupied West Bank is on fire at the moment. Over 65 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank have been killed since the crisis began on October 7th. And settlers are rampaging throughout the region. By now it's likely more, but I haven't been able to confirm that. 2 villages, as far as I know, have been depopulated entirely. And so, at least as of recording this, we're on the precipice of a regional war. We're on the precipice of something that could be much bigger than what it already is. And I would say that's where we're looking at right now.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a comment on something I've noticed personally. This has been the biggest sort of international emergency where the total degradation of Twitter has really come to the fore. I mean, say what you like about the previous regime before Elon Musk bought it, but it used to be that you could go to Twitter and with a little bit of work, you could find an unprecedented real-time view into what was going on the ground in any sort of crisis like this. And, probably certain aspects of this conflict would have made that harder. But now Twitter, I would say, is basically worthless as far as trying to get accurate information. there's just all kinds of disinformation flying around on there. There's no way to tell really anymore, who is, actually who they say they are. The verification badges are all but worthless. It's like, you're verified to have paid $8. And anyway, I think was maybe a semi-intentional purpose of Elon Musk buying this in the first place to basically just flood the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon has said. And yeah, you really feel the absence of Twitter reporting and perspectives, and how confusing it has been, and how many different claims of like, oh, there was a hospital blown up. Was the hospital blown up by the IDF? Was it blown up by Hamas? How many people died? And all this, and people just like having these super heated arguments back and forth about stuff where you can't even find, a consistent, picture from what actually happened. It's a real shame. Before we go on about the more about the current, crisis, you're an expert in like Palestinian history. And I thought it would be worthwhile, or in our previous episode, David Cleons, said he's, he knows the basic, like gist of things, but he's not so, read up on the details. And you mentioned 1948. Obviously, that's when Israel was, first established. But since then, basically, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Gaza and the occupation post like 1973? In 67, right? You had the 6-Day War, which Israel won easily. Then in 73, you had the Yom Kippur War, where Israel was ambushed, and it was a sort of close run thing. And then after that, you've had like this period of, basically trying to perpetuate the occupation. So can you tell us about that?
Yes. And I think this is an important node to connect to our current day because of the psychological impact, which I'll get to in a second. But as far as the history of Gaza goes, and Cleon, I think, did a wonderful job of giving a cursory introduction to the identity and importance of Gaza for Palestinians, more than, I believe it's 70%, more than 70% of Gazans are direct descendants of people who were displaced by the Nakba. And since the Israeli occupation, from the Israeli occupation of around 1973 onward, the administration of Gaza, like that of the rest of the occupied territories, involved a system of fragmentation, of intentional dissolution of Palestinian civil society. And this is really when, over time, we saw the erosion of the secular nationalist movements in Fatah and in the various socialist and Marxist-Leninist and otherwise left-wing leaning organizations like the PFLP or various groups that were more self-described communistic. And this is when the Muslim Brotherhood's branch in Gaza, now known as Hamas, essentially, became very effective at establishing a social base. Something that you'll hear on Twitter, to your point about misinformation and shallow understanding. A lot of people rightfully point out that Bibi Netanyahu has a history of promoting Hamas as a means of maintaining the fracture in Palestinian politics. But not many people understand that Hamas has a genuine social base that goes back to the 1980s, goes back further, in its establishment of masjids and its establishments of charities and hospitals, and that it provided an alternative after the left wing was assassinated, sabotaged, internally fragmented over various things. And this sets the stage eventually for the Oslo world to have this dramatic split in the 2005-2006 elections, where Hamas essentially took over the Gaza Strip after Israel had ceded control in agreement with Oslo in some form of self-government, which we now know that the degradation of Oslo is in large part what has led to this engendered crisis of occupation and of apartheid.
Can you hang on? Sorry to interrupt. Can you explain what the Oslo Accords were, just in case listeners haven't heard of that?
Oh, of course. So in the late 1980s, after decades of frustration about this lack of a viable pathway for self-determination, Palestinians who had a decade prior seen a bit of a rejuvenation with regards to their political identity, insofar as going back to 1967 for a real quick second. Palestinians in Israel proper had lived for 20 years as citizens, and yet citizens who were subject to martial law, exclusively ethnic imposed martial law, only applied to them. And in 1966, that was lifted, and that gave them a new opportunity to interact with the wider Arab world. They were no longer so systematically surveilled and limited in their movement. But then, of course, in 1967, 1 year later, the occupation of the rest of historic Palestine commenced. And this had a paradoxical effect of bringing the Palestinians in the occupied territories that we know now and the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel closer together. They were now under effectively the same sovereign state's control. And those 10 years of reunification of sorts, albeit under different legal regimes, allowed for a festering of frustration, allowed for a new sense of this problem being lodged in place. And eventually the First Intifada broke out. And the First Intifada was a mixture of nonviolent, violence, decentralized protest movements. It involved village councils. It involved various political parties vying for a position as the vanguard of the Palestinian national liberation movements. And the First Intifada was largely successful in bringing people towards sympathy for Palestine. And this eventually led to the Oslo Accords in the 1990s between the PLO, which was recognized as by the UN and by the US as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the Israeli state. And essentially what the Oslo Accords did is the Palestinian Liberation Organization recognized Israel, and in exchange was provided a degree of self-government with the promise of future talks on the establishment of a Palestinian state. And if you go back and look at contemporary criticisms of Arafat and of the PLO by men like Edward Said, or men who had served as an advisor to Arafat at one point, by men like those, one of the central criticisms of Oslo was that it didn't actually promise in ironclad terms an independent Palestinian state. And so 5 years after the creation of the first Oslo Accord, the horizon was again narrowed. And here we are in 2023 with no independent Palestinian state and a sort of Bantustan system in the West Bank. And we have the siege in Gaza, which has existed since 2006, an 18-year siege. And that is more or less the horizon that we have right now.
That's the end of the preview, folks. As usual, we like to mention that this podcast is sponsored by the American Prospect magazine. So if you want to listen to the whole thing, you can subscribe at $5 a month if you want that, plus a free subscription to the website, plus the opportunity for a steeply discounted print subscription. You can do that if you so wish at $10 a month. And otherwise, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.